issues that will win votes.
Are there any other important issues which have not been addressed in this campaign?
Well, yeah, I think there are. And admittedly, not all of these on the agenda of voters, but you'd like to think in an ideal world, and if you want to call me naive for talking about an ideal world, so be it, policies that I think are important to Australia's longer term future. And one of those, for example, is the fact that Australia is faced with, according to the most recent budget, a further decade of consistent budget deficits. We're not getting back to surplus, according to the medium-term projections in the most recent federal budget, until 2035-36. And given all the additional spending that's been announced during the election campaign, without any real indication as to how it's going to be paid for, we probably won't be back in balance or surplus even by 2035-36. Now, to be sure, deficits aren't always bad, and in particular, it was right for our governments to run budget deficits during the global financial crisis and during the COVID pandemic. But the quid pro quo for acknowledging that it's okay to run deficits in the face of economic shocks or downturns is that you should be willing to run balanced budgets or surpluses when things are going okay, as we're being told they will over the next decade. Well, we're not doing that. It's also true that Australia's not in as bad a position with regard to our nation's finances as many other so-called advanced economies, in particular the United States, Japan, the UK, and many continental European economies have much worse budgetary positions than we do. But that's hardly a cause for comfort, especially given that, unlike, for example, Japan or Italy or Germany, Australia is once again reliant on external financing to supplement some of the shortfall between what we save as a nation and what we want to invest. And as we know from our own history, that can leave us to some extent at the mercy of the whims of the international financial community. So we are looking at deficits for the next 10 years. That's because it's been clear since the last budget of the previous coalition government, introduced in April 2022, that government spending, that is federal government spending, is set to be on a plane as a percentage of GDP that's between 1.5 and 2 percentage points higher than the average that has pertained between the end of the Whitlam years in 1975-6 and the onset of COVID in the 2019-20 financial year. And there are three reasons for that. One is that the public very clearly wants more government spending on health, aged and disability care, which is hardly surprising given that the proportion of our population who are old, aging, or who are living with disability is rising all the time. And in the aftermath of the revelations of the Royal Commissions into aged and disability care about 4 or 5 years ago. And you could also add to that list a growing demand for governments to play more of a role in making childcare available and affordable so that women can play a similar role to men if they want to in the workforce. And the public is, I think, saying that any political party who says you can't have that additional spending in those areas is not going to win government or remain in government for very long. The second thing is that there's a clear bipartisan consensus that Australia needs to spend more on defence than we have been doing in recent years. And we've discussed that in the conversations I've had with Rowan Moffat over recent weeks. So hopefully some people will have seen them. And if you haven't, I commend them to look at. And that's particularly now with the return of Donald Trump to the White House. Either in order to appease Donald Trump, we have to spend more on defence, because he's saying they're not going to play the role they traditionally have done in defending Australia and other traditional US allies if we all don't spend more on our own defence. Or perhaps, I would say more realistically, since the US is showing that we can't rely on it as a trusted security partner, we have to spend more on defence anyway for that reason. And clearly, whether the public like it or not, want it or not, we're going to get more spending on defence. And the third thing is that precisely because successive governments on both sides of the political divide have run up more than $800 billion of gross debt since the onset of the global financial crisis, and according to the most recent budget, are going to run up another $900 billion plus over the next 10 years in gross debt, we have to spend a lot more on interest than we used to do when the budget was in surplus and Australia was a net creditor, as it was on the eve of the financial crisis. So it's not easy to think of ways in which those three areas of additional spending pressure can be offset by cuts in other areas of government spending. I mean, people who are familiar with my views know that one thing I would advocate is stop giving Western Australia $7 billion a year more than they need to provide the same level of services as the rest of Australians get from their state governments, whilst levying on them similar burdens of state taxes. That what I've described as the worst public policy decision of the 21st century will cost the federal budget $57 billion over 11 years. It ought to be scrapped. But even if that were to happen, it still wouldn't go very far to offsetting the additional spending that I've just described. So again, in an ideal world, this election campaign would have seen both sides of politics having what some people might call an adult conversation with the Australian electorate about what are the least economically damaging and fairest ways of raising an additional, say, 1 to 1.5 percentage points of GDP in revenue. And again, in an ideal world, they'd be offering different visions of how to do that, and the people could make an informed choice, as they should be able to do in a democratic political system like Australia's. But sadly, as I sometimes say, in these circumstances, I'm more likely to wake up one morning and see a thylacine running across my front lawn than I am for that adult conversation to be taking place. Sadly, it isn't in this campaign. Nor really are the political parties talking to Australians about the challenges that lie ahead in the world that's now being upended by Donald Trump and will likely to be continued to be upended by Donald Trump's successors. I think the reality is that we can't rely on the United States in the way that we have been inclined to do for the last 80 years since the end of World War II, and particularly since the signing of the ANZUS Treaty in the early 1950s. We have to chart our own way in the world. And in particular, we shouldn't be, in my view, allowing the United States to dictate what is in our national interests. The US, understandably, from its perspective, feels threatened by the rise of China as a rival, as the world's biggest economy and the most powerful military. I mean, there's plenty of examples in history, most recently perhaps the way Britain could not but have felt threatened by the emergence of Germany as a European powerhouse in the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries. And we know where that led. The US's position of itself, its impression of itself as the global hegemon, cannot be helped but be threatened by the emergence of China as a rival for that. But Australia's position as what we like to call a middle-ranking power, as a small, open economy, isn't threatened by the rise of China in that way. Indeed, the emergence of China as one of the world's biggest economies, as the world's biggest importer of commodities and its biggest exporter of manufactured goods, has been enormously beneficial to Australia. It's underwritten a good deal of the prosperity that we have enjoyed in the last 25 or so years. And that means that our relationship with China ought to be different from the relationship that the United States has with China. But again, nobody's really talking about that in the context of this election campaign, nor is anyone really seriously talking about the challenges of lifting productivity. Productivity is, as Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has famously said, if it isn't everything in the long run, it's almost everything when it comes to underwriting sustainable increases over time in people's living standards. And if it wasn't for the benefits that Australia's reaped from strong Chinese demand for our commodity exports and their willingness to pay very high prices for them over the last 25 years, our very poor productivity performance would have meant that we'd have seen even more serious stagnation and even bigger falls in material living standards than the ones that have occurred over the last 3 or 4 years that the coalition in particular has made much of in its election campaign. But neither side of politics is really offering much, if anything, that gives you any reason to believe that productivity growth in Australia is going to be crawling out of the basement where it's been hiding for the last 10 years. So that's a disappointment as well. And then partly related to that, I would say there's not been any serious discussion in this election campaign of our education system. Statistics compiled by the OECD and other international organisations show that the performance of Australia's school education system has been declining relative to that of other parts of the world for more than 10 years. And that in particular, it's increasingly failing students who come from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds. And it's also becoming increasingly apparent that our systems of post-secondary education, both universities and TAFE or vocational education systems, aren't doing their job of fitting younger Australians, and for that matter, Australians whose skills are at risk of being no longer relevant in tomorrow's rapidly changing economy, with the skills they need to succeed in the world of the future. Now, that's another topic that we've been discussing in this series for In Economics with Emeritus Professor Brian Stoddart, who's the former Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne's La Trobe University. And again, that's a series that I commend people watching this podcast to have a look at if they're interested in exploring some of the issues associated with our education system. Sadly, that's something that hasn't been discussed in this election campaign either.
As you have been discussing with Rowan and Brian,
Not very positive outlook for voters to choose from.
Given this consideration, what do you think will be the outcome of the election?